Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in again to OTRAM's YouTube channel, your source for Land Cruiser modification and repair videos. Today we're doing the first video disassembly on an 80 series 1FZ-FE head gasket. So let me pan you over here and we'll get into it. And I've got the engine obviously out of the truck, so we're going to have to play make-believe with some of the things that are already disconnected. But I figured with it out of the truck, we'd have a better view of everything for doing the video. So I usually start on the passenger side with the exhaust manifolds, just because they're fairly easy to get out of your way. Normally you've got to undo the downpipes from down here. Obviously they're already off because we've got the truck out. So we can start with taking off these heat shields. And they're just a 12mm headed bolt. There we go. And I've got some baggies back here to organize all my bolts as I take them off. So we're going to set those heat shields aside. We're going to take some Freol. And we're going to hit all the manifold studs. And I'm going to go ahead and hit these over here too, just to give me a fighting chance. So while we let that soak for a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and take the heater pipe off. Normally you'd have a heater hose coming down right here, and then you've also got this ground strap that goes up to by the heater control valve on the firewall. Pop that out, put that guy aside, and then another bolt up here. And you've got two nuts right there. Need an extension to get on that one. That's better. We can go ahead and pop that guy off. And I'm going to go ahead and take the engine hook, the kick-down cable bracket, and the throttle cable bracket off. Because our machinist likes those out of the way. And the engine bracket's a 14. There we go. And let's see if the manifold bolts will cooperate. And they will. And sometimes they come out with the stud still on them. That's fine. You'll just have to remove the stud before you put everything back together. I'm actually going to go through with a wrench and crack all these free, just to make it a little bit easier on my low impact. And I'll zip ahead. You guys don't need to see me take all of these out. And there you can see we've got both of our exhaust manifolds off. While I'm over here on this side, I'm gonna go ahead and take the, I guess you call it the thermostat feed pipe off. It's two 12mm bolts here. And then it just pops loose. And you kind of wiggle it up. There's an O-ring on the head face, and then there's a tube with an O-ring that goes here in the bottom. I'm going to grab a pair of pliers and wiggle the pipe out. You just want to be careful not to scar this up because it seals with O-rings. There you go, there's two O-rings, so you'll replace those when you do the gasket. Come on, focus. There you go. And I'll go ahead and take this little throttle body feed pipe or feed hose off, because we're going to do that in a little bit. So that's basically the passenger side of the block. So now we can move over to the top and start taking some of this stuff off. So let me reframe you and we'll move over here. So now we can go ahead and take our throttle body off. We're going to start by taking this breather hose here off the top. And then we can take the electrical fittings off of the idle air control valve and the throttle position sensor. And we can take the two hoses that are going to the EGR modulator off. Actually, I'm going to pop the EGR modulator just all the way off so it's out of my way. And then normally you would still have all the throttle cables and kickdown cables on here. I normally leave them attached, and when I take the throttle body off, I just flop it over the side so it's out of my way, but the throttle cables don't get readjusted. And there's two 12mm bolts down here underneath. Right here. And they kind of line up right with the grooves in the valve cover. Get those loose. And then there's two up here. The two shorter ones are the top bolts, the longer ones are the bottom bolts. And then I neglected to take these vacuum hoses off, so we're going to pop those real quick. There we go. And then right down here, there's a little coolant hose that keeps the carburetor, the throttle body from icing up. We're going to grab that hose clamp, slide it back. There we go, that's getting out of my way. And we'll slide this hose back. Go. And then we can kind of rock the whole throttle body over to the side and take out the long bolts from underneath. And then normally this back hose would be another spring fitting, but somebody's put a hose clamp on this one in the past. So we're going to loosen that up. That guy out of our way. Now we can set the throttle body off to the side. Okay, I'm not sure how much of the video of this we just lost because my camera battery apparently went dead. But I just pulled the hoses off of the EGR modulator that sits here. These two vacuum lines over here. And then there's two short 12mm bolts on the top right here. And two longer ones that come through from the bottom that kind of line up with these notches. I also removed the three electrical connectors over here for the throttle body, the idle air control valve, and then this smaller one under here. And then before I pulled the throttle body off, actually I'll pull the PCV hose out of my way too. There's this small coolant hose that goes on this pipe right here. You pull that and that'll let you swing the throttle body up and out so that you can get to this coolant hose that goes right here. And once all that's undone, you can take your throttle body and set it off to the side. And now we can start getting more of the top torn down. Now with our throttle body out of the way, we can move on to getting these spark plug cover shields off. And they're just 4 10mm, which somebody left that one out. And just lift those off and leave the bolts in their holes. And then you've got 1 10mm here and one over here. And we can start popping spark plugs out of their bores, or spark plug wires rather. And sometimes it takes some wiggling to get these to come loose. These look fairly new, so they're not super stuck in there yet. There we go, and come around here to the side and pull the distributor wiring connector out. And then I'm going to take the distributor cap off. There's 3 8mm bolts. Right there. And we can take this and the wires all off as one piece. Now normally you'd have your coil wire still hooked to the coil down in the truck. Set this off to the side. And with that out of the way, we can move on to pulling the valve cover itself. And it's just a series of 10mm bolts going all the way around it. Normally, this one in the back corner is kind of a pain to get to because the heater control valve and wiring are right on top of it. And then this one directly below the EGR modulator is tricky just because it's hard to snake in there. And I'm going to grab a screwdriver. You just lightly pop. There we go. Get that freed up. And we can lift our valve cover off. And that one's pretty grungy in there, so that'll end up going through the parts washer before we reassemble. And while I'm over here, gonna go ahead and pop the distributor out as well. And that's just one bolt here on the adjuster, and then it wiggles out. So we can set that off to the side. And let me re-angle you, and we'll start taking the upper plenum off. Okay, taking the upper plenum loose, first thing I like to do is lose this power steering reservoir. Okay, so take the power steering reservoir off. There's two 12 millimeters, or three, I'm sorry. There we go, and then now your power steering reservoir is out of the way. We're also going to take the oil dipstick off there. And then there's another 12 down here where it goes into the oil pan. And then some wiggling and finagling will get that out. And then normally you would also have the transmission dipstick bolted on right here. We're going to take this ground cable off the back, although that's lower plenum, so we don't actually have to do that yet. And then a lot of times you'll have a brace that runs from here down to the block. That one's missing on this truck, so we don't have to worry about it. Let me swing you back around this way, because I forgot to hit the EGR pipe while we're over here. So we want to undo the EGR valve. So we're going to squirt those studs, and then we're going to squirt the connector really good on both sides. We're going to grab our big pliers. Normally, that does not come loose that easily. Slip that nut back. And hit these two 12s. Pull those out. And then what I usually like to do is actually pull the studs here out. This one came out with the nut. And those are an E8 Torx. On the end there, and well, somebody has already chewed the end of this one off. So we're just going to leave that be, and then when we pop the rest of the manifold, we'll deal with it then. So let's come back around over here. Now we can carry on with undoing the upper. So on the upper, you've got Actually, I'm going to grab a swivel. You've got one back here, right above the oil filter. It does not want to pop loose. So that's a long bolt. And then you've got a short one right here, pretty much in front of it. There's another short one right here. And another one here, which you can see that one. And this one. Actually, I'm going to crack all these off and then come back and hit them with the impact to spin them loose. But there's a nut here, a nut here, and then another long one back and down here. And it's easiest to come up from the bottom with long extensions and swivels to get these. Once all that's off, we can come up here. We've already undone this long breather hose, so we can just undo the little shorty one here. And then we can come around to the back side here. We're going to undo the Egr Temp Sensor. And we're going to pry its wire up off this mount here. We're going to take the, I don't know if you guys can see that, but this hose is just melted. That's the Egr hose that feeds the modulator. We can take that off, and then we can just wiggle. Oh, I forgot one hose. I forgot the hose. I forgot the hose right here going to the fuel pressure regulator. And sometimes if these are sticky, if you just lightly grab them with pliers and swivel them, they'll free up. Now we can wiggle all this out, except for, let me drop you down so you can see what I'm pulling. There's two hoses that come down here onto a temp sender. I don't know if you can see it back here, but there's this temperature sender, or not temperature, vacuum switch temperature thing that these two hoses go on. So pull those off, be careful. Those are plastic and prone to breaking after 30 years. And now we can lift this all the way out. I normally pull these EGR studs because it makes it easier to lift this straight up when you're not fighting the EGR valve, but when it's loose of that nut, it's not terrible to lift up. And then let me resituate you and we'll start pulling wiring harness. Okay, so now that we've got the upper intake off, we can go ahead and start removing our wiring harness. So normally this whole chunk back here would be hooked to the firewall. We're gonna take the 2 screws out here to take that loose, and we're gonna pretend that that's already off. And then we're gonna start taking our fuel injector wires out, which they're just straight down here. And we'll pull them all out. And these are actually coming out way easier than they usually do. So we'll get all those. And then we're gonna come over here, and I'm just out of frame, but there's a wire clipped on the front here. And I'm just gonna take it loose of its holder by just popping up the little tab in the back and sliding it down. And now the injector harness and the throttle body harness is all loose. I've seen some videos where people leave the lower intake in the vehicle so they don't have to snake the harness out of it. And you unbolt the intake from the head and set it to the side. I did that once and ended up bumping the knock sensors on the block and breaking them and having to buy $600 in knock sensors. So I take the trouble now to pull the harness all the way out. And then we're gonna come around here to the bottom. Actually, let me move my light. We go, we're gonna come around here and we can start undoing all the plugs that are under here. You've got a couple of temp sensors. Come on. Here. And then these are the knock sensors. Be real careful with these because a lot of times they're brittle and this portion will break off. And then there's another knock sensor back here at the back. And then there's a clip here. Well, normally you would unclip that, but these are so brittle, they just broke. You've got this wire coming around to the bottom. That's your crank sensor. Come on. There we go. So there's that one off. You've got one down here at the bottom for the oil level float. Let me grab a little pocket screwdriver. When these get really caked in oil, they can be a pain to get loose because all the grime's packed up in them. So there we go, that one's loose. And then we had the ground wire that used to go to the bottom of the intake. And then this wire was the one that went up here to the, oh, I'm going brain dead. The temp sensor for the EGR. So then up above your starter, you'll have these 2 big bundles of wire, and these are your transmission harness. There we go. And then you'll have 2 long wires that snake over the back of, or over the top of the transmission. And one of them will have a big harness. This goes to the park neutral safety switch on the side of the trans. And then this one runs over next to it. You've got a little temp sensor for the trans that splits off of the wire that goes to your 2 oxygen sensors. So these will both be tucked and draped over the top of the trans. You'll have to go to the passenger side, undo those, and snake them over. So now we've got all that, so it's ready and can come up through in a minute. And it also gives us room to pull some of this back to get it out of the way so that we can get our fuel rail out. Before we pull the fuel rail, we need to disconnect it from the fuel filter, which is right down here. We've already disconnected the front hose, the inlet from the fuel filter when we pulled the motor. So it's a 17 wrench, and a lot of times it's easiest just to fish it down through the hole in the intake, and you can get on there and pop it loose. Since I've got the engine out, I'm just going to do it this way. And dump gas everywhere, because there's still gas in the rail. Awesome. And whoever did the fuel filter last butchered it putting it in, so it's sitting crooked, and it's making the fuel rail crooked. But now that we've got the wiring tucked out of the way, we can come in here, and there's a couple of 12s, or I guess there's 3 12s, that hold the fuel rail on. We're going to pop those off, or pop those loose. And I'm going to take this front one. Actually, I'm going to take all these out. And then we'll come around the front here and take the return line off of the regulator. And once that's done, we can wiggle the fuel rail up and out with all of our injectors. And we can set all that off to the side. And then now that we've got the injectors out, we can start pulling the harness up and out of here. And normally you would just be flopping that to the side in the truck. Okay, and then there's 3 plastic spacers that go with the fuel rail. Just make sure you don't lose those. I'm gonna set those over here with my fuel rail bolts. Move my light back. Oop. Okay, so now we've got everything under here that's going to be in the way of us lifting the head off. We just need to come to the front here and take our alternator out so we can get the bracket and this water outlet pipe out of the way. So we're going to take a 14 and loosen the alternator pivot bolt. Whoop. We can just go ahead and take that one out. And then there's a 12 down here at the bottom for the adjustment. So we're going to pull that one out. And once those are out, come on. There we go. We can take that guy out of the way, along with its hardware. And then we can just go ahead and pop the alternator bracket off. Okay, we'll set this over to the side. And then the last thing we've really got to mess with before we start pulling the cams and getting the head ready is this feed pipe for the throttle body coolant. And there's one bolt up here, and then there's two just on the front of the head. And this leads over to the pipe that we took off when we were taking the coolant pipes off when we did the exhaust manifold. So we'll take that out, set this off to the side, and then so you can see it just bolts to the front of the head with these two and goes around. And now let me shift you around and we'll start taking the cams out to get ready to remove the head. Okay, so we've got the valve cover off. We've got everything, wiring harness, fuel rails, everything out of here. So now we're ready to actually start taking the cams out so we can get the head gasket or the head bolts out. And the first thing we need to do is set everything to top dead center. So I'm going to come around to the front on my crank pulley with a 30mm socket. And I'm going to spin everything over until my timing mark comes around. And I'm going to line that up with 0. And then I'm going to come around to the back side of the cam. And you're not really going to be able to see it, but right down in here, there's a double dot mark. There's double dots here in the middle that have a paint stripe through them. Those line up when you're at top dead center, number 1. And then you'll see double dots on the outside edge. Those will be flat with the valve cover surface. So there we know that we're at top dead center. I'm going to grab a pair of pliers and I'm going to wiggle the cam plugs out of the front of the head. And they just kind of wiggle and pull straight up. We're going to set those off to the side. There we go. And now I'm going to pull the cam sprocket. But first I'm just going to break the bolt loose. It's a 19mm here on the front. And there's a hex here on the camshaft that you can use to counter hold. Whew. And this is not fun on an engine stand. But that guy's loose. I'm going to come back and look and make sure I'm still at top dead center. And I am, so I'm going to roll that back. Before I take this sprocket off, I'm going to run some zip ties through it to make sure that it doesn't move in relation to the camshaft. So my sprocket doesn't lose its relationship to the chain. Because you don't want to have to refish the sprocket back up. Stick those on there. Trim off the excess. And now I can take this bolt out. Come on. And you'll have the bolt and then also the gear that drives the distributor. So we're going to set those off to the side. Before I pop the sprocket completely off, Before I pop the sprocket completely off, I need to bring you down a little bit. There we go. I'm going to come down here and undo these two 12s, and those are going to let us take the timing chain tensioner out. And it just kind of wiggles. Well, usually they'll kind of spring themselves out. There we go. Usually, those aren't seized in there nearly that tight. This one, I think it suffered from lack of oil changes over the years because everything's just really coked up inside. But anyway, now that we've got that loose, there's nothing down here pushing our timing chain guide in. So we can go ahead and wiggle the cam sprocket off of the front of the cam. Come on. We can just gently let it sit down in the front of the head there. So now that the sprocket's off, we can go ahead and we need to put a service bolt in the spring-loaded portion of the exhaust cam. So we're going to spin that until you'll see this through hole. It'll come around here in just a minute. You'll see this through hole here come around to the top, and we're going to put a bolt through from the front. And I've just got to find a bolt real quick because I wasn't prepared. And it's just a short 6mm bolt. We're going to feed that through. And what that's doing, the exhaust cam is split and it's spring-loaded between the two halves to take up the backlash. If you remove the cam without that lock pin in there, the spring will sprung. And we don't want that, so we're going to snug that in. And then we're going to set our 2-dot marks. Where'd my pliers go? We're going to set our 2-dot marks till they're about 35 degrees, pointing that way on the exhaust cam. So what that's going to do is set our number 4 and our number 6 caps so that this one is just on the inboard side of its lifter, and this one is just on the outboard side of its lifter. And I went a little bit, there we go. You can just kind of eyeball to make sure these are evenly spaced on their lifters. And what that's going to do, when we loosen them, it's going to let this cam come straight up out of its bore. Now we can start taking cam bolts out. We're going to start with the number 1. And we're going to alternate back and forth. Take that out. And these are all marked with their position and an arrow pointing forwards. So we're going to take the number 1 off. And then we're going to loosen all of them except for 4 and 6. All of them on the exhaust cam side. So I like to go through and just crack them loose first. And then I'll zip all these out and I'll bring you guys back for the next step. Okay, so now that we've got everything but 4 and 6 removed, we can alternately loosen 4 and 6. And I'll just do one turn at a time, working back and forth between the caps. And you'll see the camshaft start to slowly rise up out of its bearings. If it starts getting crooked, stop and snug things back down and start going again, because there's a chance of nicking the camshaft bearing or even cracking it if you let it get out of level. There we go. So those are all the way loose. And we can take our caps off and set them off to the side with the others. Now we can lift our exhaust cam out. Be careful when you lift these. The edges of them are razor sharp. We're going to put the 2-dot mark to roughly 25 degrees. We're going to go down a little bit. And we're going to line up 2 and 5 as far as centering up our cam lobes. And there we go. And same thing, I'm going to take the front cap loose. The front cap is your thrust bearing for the camshaft. So this one comes out first because it's got the side thrust and you don't want it to get tweaked. And sometimes they're a little sticky. There we go. A little rubber mallet action. We'll pop it loose. And now we're going to go through and crack all of them but 2 and 5. I'll zip all those loose. And now we can take 2 and 5, crack them loose, and same as before, we'll just slowly work those up and out. And it's tempting to just spin these loose and, you know, run them out real quick. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have to buy a new head because you got the camshaft crooked. There we go. Those are finally loose. Go. And now we can gently lift our intake cam up and out. And let me wash my hands real quick and we'll start pulling head bolts. Okay, so now we're all set and ready to start pulling the head. You're going to need a 12 millimeter socket. Half-inch drive on a fairly large bar to make this feasible. And then I don't know if you can make it out, but you've got to loosen these in a proper order. So I take a magic marker and 1, 3, 5, 7. I write it next to all the bolts. So we'll go ahead and start cracking them free. So there's 1. And then number 2's over here, if I can get it on there. There's 2, and that one's quite loose. 3. 4, and this is so you evenly take the tension off the head so it doesn't crack. 5. And 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. This is a lot of fun to do on a stand. 12. 13. And 14. So those are all cracked loose. So I'm going to switch to a daintier ratchet now. And I'm going to go back around again because my outside ones snugged up a bit. Oh, just the first one. Oops, I'm going out of order. Okay, we're all broken free on those. So now, let me just pull all these out. Okay, so I've gone ahead, I've pulled all of our cylinder head bolts out. And I just had a magnet and I just set it down. Got all our head bolts out. We need to go back. The head bolt washers are going to stay down, stuck to the head. You want to take a magnet and fish all of those out. Otherwise, you're going to forget. You're going to leave one stuck in there, and then it's going to get lost at the machine shop. Not that I've ever done that and know it from experience. So we've got all of those. We're going to stick them over here with our head bolts. And then the valves are adjusted with shims on top of the lifter buckets. And they're different thicknesses. So you want to make absolutely sure that they go back exactly where they came from. So I take a paint pen and mark them, intake 1, intake 2, exhaust 1, exhaust 2. you know, all the way down the row. That way I can put them back where they came from. And then, oop, that's great. You can just use a magnet, and if you just kind of wiggle and swivel them, they'll come up out of their holes. Come on. And I like to pull these out before I take the head off to make sure that if we tilt the head taking it off or anything like that, that we don't chance having these fall out and get out of order. Because it'd be a not pleasant day if you had to go back through and reset all these and figure out which one goes where. There we go. Okay, so now we've got all the valve shims out. We're ready to take the head off. When you're pulling the head, let me slide this a little bit. When you're pulling the head off, there's a plastic timing chain guide right down here that comes up higher than the head. So you want to make sure that you pick the head straight up and you don't break that guide. And I'm going to take, there's a couple of spots to stick a screwdriver so you can lift and try to break the head gasket free. So there, it's popped free out back. And that should wiggle up. And I've got Illustrious Crash to give me a hand. Just go. Can you wiggle yours? Oh. Da-da-da. There's 2 bolts down here at the front that I thought I had already taken out. I have not taken those out. Don't forget to take those out. And that is also why we don't force things. These should make it much easier to get the head off. Now we can pick straight up and come over to the side and just lay this on its side until I get a piece of cardboard ready. And this is the timing chain guide that we were worried about. And there's our head gasket off. And we can peel our head gasket up and sit off to the side. And now we're done with the block portion. Oop. I just dropped that piece of carbon down in there. I'll fish that out in a bit. We'll clean this all up later and clean up some of the piston schmoo. I like to take like WD-40, something like that, and spray down the inside of the cylinders so they don't flash rust being out in the open. But for now, we're done with the block portion. Let me get the head set up to finish stripping it, and I'll bring you guys back. Okay, so now we're just about finished up and ready to take this to the machine shop. We just got to strip the rest of the bits off the side of the head. So we're going to take our EGR pipe off, and it's just 2 12mm bolts here. We'll set that over to the side. Put the bolts here in a bag. Take that bolt out of our way. Then we come over here to the front, to the water neck. And take the two 12mm nuts off of it. Come on. Pull it off and set it out of the way. And now we can just go through and take all the 12mm holding the intake on. We can take the lower intake off. Go ahead and take our gaskets off. Put our hardware in there. And now we're going to take that engine lifting bracket off. And it's just two 14s. And then we've just got the sensors here. And I usually take my smartphone, snap a picture of which way these went in. That way I know for sure which way to put them back. And these just thread out. And you also want to pay attention. Some of them have sealing rings on them, and some of them don't. Like this one has a copper crush washer on it. And this one with the vacuum fittings, you want to make sure you pay attention to which way the lines were pointing. And there we go, and I'll bag those up in a bit. We can take the little bit of pesky heater hose off. Save that. And we can take the water pipe that feeds the throttle body off. And a lot of times this pipe is pretty crusty, or this hose rather, so it's a good time to replace it while you're in here. And then we can just take this one last harness clip, or two last harness clips off. And they're just 12mm bolts. And there we go. We're all ready to send this out to the machine shop. So yeah, once we get this back from the machine shop, I'll bring you back for the assembly video. So I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please subscribe below. If you really liked it, check out our Patreon link down in the description and throw some support our way. I'll catch you next time for the reassembly on this. Thanks for tuning in.